Dust rose on the horizon like a vengeful specter as Matthew Jameson spurred his horse forward, each hoofbeat bringing him closer to the land that was once his birthright, now nothing more than a distant memory and a wound that refused to heal. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving Colorado sun beat down upon his weather-worn face as he crested the final hill overlooking the once prosperous Jameson farm in Coloma, Colorado Territory. The sight that greeted him made his chest tighten. Overgrown fields where corn once stood tall, a dilapidated farmhouse with its sagging porch, and the skeletal remains of a barn that had collapsed under the weight of neglect and harsh winters. Matthew pulled the reins, bringing his chestnut gelding to a halt. He removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair that had once been the color of rich soil, now streaked with premature gray at 32 years of age. 8 years had passed since he'd last laid eyes on this place. 8 years since the bank had foreclosed while he was away fighting in the remaining skirmishes that followed the war. 8 years of drifting, taking odd jobs as a ranch hand, occasionally hiring his gun when times got desperate, anything to survive and to save enough money to someday return. The sound of movement caught his attention. There, near what remained of the old well, stood a woman. Her dress was simple but clean, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid that caught the afternoon sunlight. In her arms, she carried a basket filled with what looked like seed packets and small plant starts. She hadn't noticed him yet, intent on her task of examining the soil near the well. Matthew replaced his hat and nudged his horse forward. The movement caught the woman's attention and she straightened, shading her eyes against the sun to see him better. As he approached, he could see she was younger than him, perhaps in her mid-20s, with a dusting of freckles across a sun-kissed face that spoke of outdoor work rather than leisure. "Madam," Matthew called out, keeping a respectful distance, "I believe you're on Jameson land." The woman didn't retreat, merely shifted her basket to her hip and regarded him with clear hazel eyes that held neither fear nor deference. "That would be correct if the Jamesons still owned it," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm Abigail O'Connor. I purchased this property from the bank 3 months ago." Matthew felt like he'd been kicked in the chest by a mule. He'd saved for years, working himself to exhaustion, all to reclaim what was rightfully his. And now this woman, this stranger, stood before him, claiming ownership of his family legacy. "There must be some mistake," he said, dismounting with fluid grace that belied his weariness. "I'm Matthew Jameson. This land has been in my family for 3 generations." Recognition flickered across her face. "You're Timothy Jameson's son?" "I am," Matthew replied, surprised that she knew his father's name. Abigail studied him for a moment. "Mr. Jameson, I understand this is difficult, but there's no mistake. I have the deed inside. The bank foreclosed on this property years ago. It sat abandoned until I purchased it." Matthew removed his hat again, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I was away, fighting. By the time I received word that my father had passed and the bank was foreclosing, it was too late." Something in Abigail's expression softened, but her stance remained firm. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but this land is legally mine now." Matthew looked past her to the farmhouse that held every childhood memory. He possessed his mother's voice calling him in for supper, his father teaching him to repair fence posts, the Christmas when he received his first knife. All of it gone. Sold to this woman who couldn't possibly understand what it meant to him. "I've worked for 8 years to save enough to buy it back," he said, his voice low. "I've got money. I can pay you more than you paid the bank." Abigail shook her head. "It's not for sale, Mr. Jameson. I've invested everything I have in this place." She gestured to the basket she carried. "These are the first seedlings for what I hope will be a prosperous farm again. I don't intend to leave." Matthew felt anger rising within him, but years of hard living had taught him to control it. "Where are you staying? The house doesn't look habitable." "I've been sleeping in what remains of the kitchen. The roof there is sound. I've been making repairs as I can afford them." Matthew glanced at the sun, which was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Night's coming soon. I'll make camp by the creek. We can discuss this further in the morning. Abigail hesitated, then nodded. There's a fresh dug well closer to the house now. The old one ran dry years ago. You're welcome to water your horse there. It was a small courtesy, but it struck Matthew that she was offering him water from his own land. Still, he nodded his thanks and led his horse toward the house. As he approached, he could see evidence of Abigail's work. New planks had replaced rotted ones on the porch steps. A small vegetable garden had been started near the eastern side of the house, where it would catch the morning sun. A clothesline with a few garments fluttered in the breeze. Matthew watered his horse and unsaddled him, securing him to a post that still stood near the remains of the barn. Then he gathered his bedroll and saddlebags and headed toward the creek that ran along the western edge of the property. It was where he and his father had fished on lazy summer evenings, where he'd learned to swim, where he'd courted Mary Beth Wilson before she'd married the banker's son instead of waiting for him to return from war. As he prepared his camp, Matthew struggled with conflicting emotions. This woman, Abigail, had legal right to the land, he didn't dispute that. But the Jameson farm was the only home he'd ever known, the only place he'd ever felt truly belonged. How could he just walk away from it again? Meanwhile, Abigail returned to the farmhouse, her mind troubled by the appearance of Matthew Jameson. She'd heard stories about the Jameson family from townspeople in Coloma, how Timothy Jameson had worked the land until his death, how his son had gone off to fight and never returned. Some said he'd been killed in battle, others claimed he'd found better prospects elsewhere. No one expected him to return after so many years. Abigail lit a lantern as darkness fell, illuminating the single room she'd made habitable. A straw mattress lay in one corner, covered with clean linens. A trunk containing her few belongings sat nearby. She'd repaired the cast iron stove and now set about making a simple supper of cornbread and beans. As she worked, she considered her options. Matthew Jameson had no legal claim to the land anymore, but she couldn't deny the moral complexity of the situation. This had been his home, his heritage. Yet it was now hers, the only thing she had left after losing her own family to influenza 2 years prior. The small inheritance she'd received had been just enough to purchase this run-down farm and the supplies needed to start rebuilding it. She had nowhere else to go, no family to return to. This land represented her only chance at independence and survival in a world that offered few options for a single woman. She wouldn't give it up, not even to the man whose family had worked it for generations. Morning came with a crimson sunrise that painted the plains in hues of fire. Matthew awoke at first light, as was his habit from years on the trail. He washed in the creek, the cold water shocking him fully awake, then prepared a meager breakfast of coffee and hardtack from his supplies. As he ate, he formulated a plan. He would offer to work the land with Abigail to help restore it to its former prosperity. Perhaps in time he could convince her to sell it back to him, or perhaps they could form some kind of partnership. It wasn't ideal, but it would keep him close to the only place he'd ever called home. He was saddling his horse, intending to ride into town for supplies, when he heard a scream from the direction of the farmhouse. Without hesitation, Matthew grabbed his rifle and ran toward the sound, his heart pounding. He found Abigail on the porch, backing away from the door, her face pale with fear. "What is it?" he called as he approached. "Snake," she replied, pointing inside. "A rattler. It must have come in during the night seeking warmth." Matthew approached cautiously, peering through the doorway. Sure enough, a large rattlesnake had coiled itself near the stove, its warning rattle filling the small room. "Stay back," he instructed, raising his rifle. "No," Abigail protested. "Not in the house. You'll damage what little I have." Matthew lowered his rifle, considering. "Do you have a shovel or pitchfork?" Abigail pointed to a lean-to beside the house where she kept her tools. Matthew retrieved a long-handled shovel and returned to the doorway. With careful movements, he entered the house, keeping his eyes fixed on the snake. In one swift motion, he pinned its head with the shovel blade, then quickly grabbed it behind the head with his free hand. The snake writhed and rattled furiously as Matthew carried it a safe distance from the house and released it. When he returned, Abigail was standing in the doorway, a mixture of relief and admiration on her face. "Thank you," she said. "Most men would have killed it." Matthew shrugged. "No need. It was just looking for somewhere warm. Besides, they keep the rodent population down." Abigail nodded, then hesitated before saying, "I was about to make breakfast. There's enough for two if you'd like to join me." The invitation surprised him. "That's kind of you, Miss O'Connor. Abigail, please." "Abigail," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. Inside, Matthew was struck by how much Abigail had accomplished with limited resources. The kitchen area was clean and organized, with patches of new mortar between old stones in the fireplace. She'd hung dried herbs from the ceiling beams and had a small shelf of preserved foods likely purchased in town, as she hadn't been there long enough to grow and preserve her own yet. "It's not much," she said, noticing his inspection, "but it's coming along." "You've done good work," he admitted. "Better than I expected." Abigail moved about the kitchen with efficient grace, preparing a simple meal of cornmeal mush with molasses. As they ate, Matthew studied her more carefully. Her hands were rough from work but still retained a feminine elegance. She wasn't conventionally beautiful like some of the painted ladies he'd encountered in saloons during his years of drifting, but there was a quiet strength in her features that he found compelling. "How did you come to buy this place?" he asked finally. Abigail set down her spoon. "My parents died 2 years ago in Denver. Influenza. I was working as a schoolteacher there, but after they passed, I found myself at loose ends. I had a small inheritance and wanted to make a fresh start." She gestured around them. The bank was practically giving this place away. No one wanted land so far from town with no working structures. "It wasn't always like this," Matthew said quietly. "When my father was alive, we had the best corn yields in the county. The barn housed 12 horses at one point. We even had a small apple orchard on the north side." "I saw the remains of the orchard," Abigail said. "There are 2 trees still living. I'm hoping they'll bear fruit this year." The conversation paused as they finished their meal. Matthew helped clean up without being asked, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Abigail. "I'm heading into town for supplies," he said as they finished. "Is there anything you need?" Abigail hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "Some nails would be helpful, and perhaps some window glass if you can find it. The general store in Coloma sometimes gets shipments from Denver." Matthew nodded. "I'll see what they have." As he prepared to leave, Abigail called after him. "Mr. Jameson, Matthew, I want to be clear. I sympathize with your situation, but this farm is my home now, my future." Matthew met her gaze steadily. "I understand your position, Abigail. But I hope you can understand mine as well. This land is in my blood. I can't simply walk away from it again." The ride into Coloma took just over an hour. The small mining town had grown since Matthew had last seen it, with new buildings lining the main street and more activity than he remembered. The gold rush that had given birth to the town had subsided, but enough mines remained operational to sustain the community. Matthew tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The proprietor, an older man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. "Help you, stranger?" "Looking for supplies," Matthew replied. "Nails, window glass if you have it, some coffee and flour." The shopkeeper nodded and began gathering the items. "Passing through or staying a while?" "Staying, I think. I'm Matthew Jameson." The shopkeeper paused, recognition dawning on his face. "Timothy's boy. Well, I'll be. Everyone thought you were dead or gone for good. I'm Harold Winters. I knew your father well." Matthew extended his hand. "Good to meet you, Mr. Winters. Just Harold's son. Your father was a good man. A shame what happened to that farm after he passed." Matthew nodded, not trusting himself to speak about it yet. Heard someone finally bought that place a few months back, Harold continued as he measured out coffee beans. Young woman from Denver, I believe. Abigail O'Connor, Matthew confirmed. I've met her. Harold raised an eyebrow. Have you now? She doesn't come into town much, keeps to herself. Paid cash for that land, though, must have had some savings. Matthew changed the subject. The town's grown since I was last here. There's been a resurgence in some of the mines, not like the old days, but enough to keep folks employed. We even got a proper sheriff now, not just a deputy. As if summoned by the mention, the door opened and a tall man wearing a sheriff's badge entered. He nodded to Harold, then turned his attention to Matthew. Don't believe we've met. Sheriff Daniel Carter, Matthew Jameson. Recognition crossed the sheriff's face as well. Timothy's son. Heard you were back. Word travels fast in Coloma. Matthew nodded. Just arrived yesterday. Staying out at the old Jameson place with Miss O'Connor, the question carried an undercurrent of suspicion that Matthew didn't miss. Camping nearby for now, the land belongs to her. Sheriff Carter seemed satisfied with this answer. Miss O'Connor's well-respected despite being new to these parts, keeps to herself but pays her bills and doesn't cause trouble. We look after our own here in Coloma. The warning was clear. Matthew kept his expression neutral, as it should be. After the sheriff left with a package Harold had set aside for him, the shopkeeper leaned across the counter. Don't mind Carter. He's a good lawman but takes his job protecting the womenfolk a bit too seriously sometimes. Matthew finished his purchases, adding some sugar and a small bag of hard candies as an afterthought. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to bring Abigail a gift, but it seemed the decent thing to do given her hospitality that morning. Before leaving town, Matthew stopped at the Coloma Saloon for a whiskey and to listen to the local gossip. The establishment was quiet in the early afternoon, with just a few miners and cowboys nursing drinks at scattered tables. The bartender, a burly man with an impressive mustache, served him without comment. Matthew took his drink to a corner table and observed the room. A poker game was in progress at one table, the players focused intently on their cards. At another, two men argued quietly about the price of cattle. It was a familiar scene, one Matthew had witnessed in countless saloons across the West over the past 8 years. He was finishing his whiskey when a well-dressed man entered the saloon. There was something familiar about him, but Matthew couldn't immediately place him. The man approached the bar confidently, ordering a brandy in a voice that triggered Matthew's memory. Edward Wilson. The banker's son who had married Mary Beth while Matthew was away at war. Edward hadn't noticed Matthew yet, and for a moment, Matthew considered slipping out unobserved. But pride kept him in his seat. He'd done nothing to be ashamed of, and he wasn't about to skulk away like a thief. Edward turned, drink in hand, and his eyes widened as they landed on Matthew. After a moment's hesitation, he approached the table. Matthew Jameson, I heard rumors you were back. Matthew gestured to the empty chair across from him. Edward, been a long time. Edward sat, setting his brandy carefully on the table. 8 years, give or take. What brings you back to Coloma, the farm? Matthew replied simply. Edward shifted uncomfortably. Ah, yes. Well, I imagine you've discovered it's no longer yours. I have. Miss O'Connor purchased it legally through the bank, Edward said defensively, as if Matthew had accused him of something. I'm aware. Edward studied him over the rim of his glass. Mary Beth will be surprised to hear you're back. The mention of her name still had the power to sting, though less than Matthew might have expected. How is she? Well, very well. We have 3 children now, 2 boys and a girl. Matthew nodded, unsure what response was expected of him. Congratulations seemed hollow for the family he might have had in another life. Edward finished his brandy quickly. I should get back to the bank. Father's health isn't what it was, so I've taken over most of the day-to-day operations. As Edward stood to leave, Matthew spoke. One question, Edward. Did you ever offer the farm for sale back to me? Send word about the foreclosure. Edward had the grace to look uncomfortable. Letters were sent to your last known whereabouts. When no response came, legally we had to proceed with the foreclosure. Business is business, Matthew. After Edward departed, Matthew ordered another whiskey, nursing it slowly as he considered what he'd learned. The Wilson family bank had foreclosed on his family's farm while he was away fighting, possibly without making a genuine effort to reach him. Then they'd held on to it until selling it to Abigail years later. It was nearly evening by the time Matthew started the ride back to the farm. The supplies he'd purchased were secured in his saddlebags, including the window glass carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent breaking. As he rode, he considered his options. He could contest the sale somehow, perhaps claim that proper notification of foreclosure hadn't been given. But that would mean going up against the most powerful family in Coloma, and more importantly, it would mean taking the farm from Abigail, who seemed to have purchased it in good faith. The thought of Abigail gave him pause. Despite their conflicting interests, he found himself admiring her determination and work ethic. She'd taken on a monumental task in trying to restore the farm single-handedly, and she'd made more progress than most men could have in the same time. As the farm came into view, Matthew noticed smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing from the kitchen window. It created an illusion of homecoming that was both comforting and painful. This wasn't his home anymore, yet every inch of the land called to him like a siren's song. He found Abigail on the porch, mending a shirt by the last of the daylight. She looked up as he approached, setting aside her work. "You were gone longer than I expected," she said, and Matthew thought he detected a note of relief in her voice. "Ran into some old acquaintances in town," he replied, dismounting and beginning to unload his purchases. "I got everything you asked for, and a few extras." Abigail came down the steps to help him carry things inside. As they organized the supplies on the kitchen table, Matthew handed her the small bag of candies. "Thought you might like these," he said awkwardly. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a smile that transformed her features. For the first time, Matthew realized just how beautiful she was when not guarded and wary. "Thank you," she said, opening the bag and offering him one first. As they shared the simple treat, a tentative truce seemed to form between them. Abigail had prepared a stew for supper and invited Matthew to share it. As they ate, she explained her plans for the farm. "I want to start with corn, of course," she said. "The soil here is good for it, from what I've heard. But I also want to try wheat and perhaps some vegetables that can be sold in town. Diversification seems wise." Matthew nodded. "My father always said the same. We had corn as our main crop, but Mother kept a large vegetable garden and we had the orchard. The apple harvest alone could carry us through a bad season if needed. You know this land," Abigail said, studying him across the table. "Its rhythms and peculiarities, that knowledge would be valuable." Matthew set down his spoon. "Are you proposing something, Abigail?" She took a deep breath. "A partnership of sorts. You clearly have skills I lack, knowledge of this specific land that would take me years to acquire on my own. I can offer you a place to stay once more of the house is habitable and a share of whatever profits we manage to generate." "But the land remains yours," Matthew stated flatly. "Yes, the deed stays in my name." Matthew considered the offer. It wasn't what he wanted: ownership of his family's land, but it would allow him to work the farm again, to be connected to it in a meaningful way. "And perhaps over time circumstances might change. I accept," he said finally, "with one condition. If you ever decide to sell, I want the first opportunity to buy." Abigail extended her hand. "Agreed, we have a deal, Mr. Jameson." As they shook hands to seal their agreement, Matthew felt an unexpected spark at the contact. Abigail must have felt it too, because she withdrew her hand quickly, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "Well then," she said briskly, standing to clear the dishes. "We should discuss what needs to be done first. The planting season won't wait for us to resolve all the repairs." The following weeks established a rhythm between them. Matthew moved his camp closer to the house, but maintained his separate sleeping area out of propriety. During the days, they worked from dawn until dusk. repairing fences, clearing fields, and preparing the soil for planting. Matthew used his knowledge of the land to show Abigail where the best soil lay, which areas drained well after rain, and which would be prone to flooding if the creek rose. She, in turn, surprised him with her own knowledge of modern farming techniques. She'd read about in agricultural journals ideas about crop rotation and soil enrichment that his father had never implemented. As they worked side by side, Matthew found himself increasingly drawn to Abigail's quiet strength and intelligence. She never complained about the backbreaking labor, even when he could see the exhaustion in her eyes at day's end. She approached each task methodically, learning quickly and adapting to the harsh realities of frontier farming with remarkable resilience. One evening, about a month after Matthew's return, they sat on the newly repaired porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. They'd spent the day planting corn in the western field, and both were pleasantly exhausted from the productive work. "You never told me why you left Denver," Matthew said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Teaching seems a more secure profession than farming, especially for a woman alone." Abigail was quiet for so long that Matthew thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft with memory. "After my parents died, the school board began pressuring me to marry. There was a widower, a board member with 3 young children, who had decided I would make a suitable mother for his children and manager for his household." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening wasn't cold. "I had no interest in him or his proposal, but they made it clear my position at the school depended on my acceptance." "So you left rather than be forced into marriage," Matthew concluded. Abigail nodded. "I wanted to build something of my own, to stand or fall by my own efforts. When I saw the advertisement for this farm so cheaply priced because of its condition, it seemed like providence." Matthew studied her profile in the fading light. That took courage. Many women would have chosen the security of marriage even to a man they didn't love. Perhaps, but I've never wanted to be dependent on someone else's goodwill. My father taught me to be self-reliant. She turned to look at him directly. "What about you? In all these weeks, you've told me about the farm, about your father, but nothing of where you've been all these years." Matthew leaned back, resting his elbows on the step behind him. "Not much to tell. After the war, I drifted. Worked cattle drives in Texas, did some mining in Nevada, even tried my hand at trapping up north. Nothing held me. I kept moving, taking whatever work came along that would add to my savings." "All to come back here," Abigail observed. "All to come back here," he agreed. "This land. It's more than dirt and rocks, Abigail. It's part of me. When I'm working it, I can almost hear my father's voice guiding my hands, feel my mother's presence in the breeze." The vulnerability in his admission hung between them, creating an intimacy neither had expected. Abigail reached out hesitantly and placed her hand over his. "I understand," she said quietly. "Not in the same way, perhaps, but I understand what it means to seek a place where you belong." The touch of her hand, warm and calloused from work, sent a current through Matthew that he hadn't felt in years. Their eyes met in the gathering dusk, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or the beginning of something deeper. The moment was broken by a distant rumble of thunder. Both looked up to see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Rain's coming," Matthew said, rising to his feet. "We should secure everything before it hits." They worked quickly in the dimming light, bringing tools under cover, checking that the newly planted seeds wouldn't wash away in a heavy downpour, and ensuring the roof patches they'd made would hold. By the time the first large drops began to fall, they had retreated to the house. "You can't sleep outside in this," Abigail said, lighting a lamp as the rain began to pound against the roof. "The kitchen is dry. I can make up a pallet for you by the stove." Matthew hesitated, conscious of propriety. "People will talk if they hear I'm staying in the house with you." Abigail's expression hardened slightly. "People will always talk. I'd rather give them something to talk about than let you catch your death of pneumonia. Besides, who's to know out here? Our nearest neighbor is miles away. The storm intensified as the night progressed, with lightning illuminating the kitchen in brief, brilliant flashes and thunder shaking the timbers of the old house. They sat at the table, playing cards by lamplight to pass the time, neither quite ready to sleep despite their physical exhaustion. "Your turn," Abigail said, watching as Matthew considered his cards. Before he could play, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the house, followed by a crash from another room. Both jumped to their feet. "That came from the north bedroom," Abigail said, grabbing the lamp. They hurried to investigate and found that part of the ceiling had collapsed under the weight of water from a leak in the roof. Rain now poured freely into the room, soaking the floor. "We need to divert the water before it damages the supporting walls," Matthew shouted over the storm's fury. He grabbed an empty bucket from the corner and positioned it under the worst of the leak, while Abigail used an old sheet to create a makeshift channel for the water to flow into the bucket rather than spreading across the floor. They worked together seamlessly, without need for discussion, each anticipating the other's movements as if they'd been a team for years rather than weeks. When they had done all they could, they stood side by side, watching their handiwork hold against nature's onslaught. "It's like the farm itself is testing us," Abigail said, brushing wet hair from her face. Matthew turned to look at her, really look at her in the wavering lamplight. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her slender frame. Her hair had come loose from its practical braid and hung in damp tendrils around her face. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek from their earlier work that the rain hadn't completely washed away. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Without conscious thought, Matthew reached out and gently wiped the smudge from her cheek with his thumb. Abigail's breath caught at the contact, her eyes widening slightly. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, the storm forgotten as something electric passed between them. Then, as if by mutual consent, they stepped apart, the moment broken but not forgotten. "We should try to get some rest," Abigail said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Tomorrow will be a long day of repairs." Matthew nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They returned to the kitchen where Abigail prepared a makeshift bed for him near the stove, as far from her own pallet as the small room would allow. As they settled into their respective beds, the lamplight extinguished, Matthew stared into the darkness, listening to the storm and the soft sound of Abigail's breathing. Something had changed between them tonight, something significant that couldn't be undone or ignored. For the first time since returning to the farm, Matthew found himself thinking not just of reclaiming his family's land, but of building something new upon it. Something that might include the remarkable woman sleeping across the room from him. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having washed everything clean. The damage was substantial, but not catastrophic. Sections of the roof would need immediate attention, and one of the newly repaired fences had partially collapsed, but the seedlings they'd planted seemed to have survived. They worked side by side repairing the roof, Matthew showing Abigail how to properly lay and secure the shingles. Her quick mind and deft hands made her an apt pupil, and by midday they had made significant progress. As they paused for a simple lunch of bread and cheese in the shade of the porch, Abigail broached a subject that had clearly been on her mind. "There's a social at the church in Coloma this Saturday," she said, focusing intently on cutting a slice of cheese. "I haven't attended any town functions since moving here. I thought perhaps we might go together." Matthew was surprised by the invitation. "Are you sure that's wise? People will certainly talk then." Abigail met his gaze directly. "As I said last night, people will talk regardless. I'd rather give them the courtesy of actually seeing us before they form their opinions. Besides, if we're to make this farm successful, we'll need the goodwill of the townspeople. Hiding away out here won't accomplish that." Her logic was sound, but Matthew suspected there was more to her invitation than practical considerations. The thought sent a pleasant warmth through him. "I'd be honored to escort you, Miss O'Connor," he said with a slight smile. "Though I should warn you, my dancing skills have grown rusty over the years." Abigail returned his smile, and Matthew was struck again by how it transformed her face. "I'm certain they'll suffice, Mr. Jameson, and perhaps the experience will serve as necessary practice." The days leading up to the social were filled with continued work on the farm and preparations for their appearance in town. Matthew rode into Coloma alone on Friday to have his good shirt laundered and pressed at the Chinese laundry, and to get a proper haircut and shave at the barber shop. These small acts of civilized grooming felt foreign after so many years of rough living, but also strangely significant, as if he were reclaiming not just his land but his place in society. While at the barber shop, Matthew overheard conversations that confirmed Abigail's concerns about town gossip. Several men were already discussing the unusual arrangement at the old Jameson place, with speculation ranging from the charitable to the scandalous. "Heard he's sleeping in the barn," one man said as hot towels were wrapped around his face. "Barn. There ain't much of a barn left out there," another countered. "More likely they're already sharing more than just farming duties, if you catch my meaning." The barber, an elderly man who had been cutting hair in Coloma since its earliest days, spoke up then. "That's enough of that talk in my shop. Miss O'Connor is a lady, and Matthew Jameson comes from good stock. His father was as honorable a man as ever worked the soil in these parts." Matthew felt a surge of gratitude toward the old barber, even as he recognized that the gossip would only intensify after he and Abigail appeared together at the social. When Saturday evening arrived, Matthew waited nervously on the porch, dressed in his best shirt and trousers, his boots polished to a shine. When Abigail emerged from the house, he momentarily forgot how to breathe. She wore a dress of deep blue calico, simple but well fitted to her slender form. Her auburn hair was arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual practical braid, with small white flowers tucked into the coils. She had applied a hint of color to her lips, and her eyes seemed to sparkle with anticipation. "You look." Matthew searched for a word adequate to express his thoughts. "Beautiful doesn't seem sufficient." A becoming blush colored Abigail's cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Jameson." The ride to town was filled with easy conversation, both of them choosing to enjoy the anticipation of the evening rather than worry about the reception they might receive. As they approached Coloma, the setting sun cast long shadows across the road, and the first stars began to appear in the eastern sky. The church was lit with lanterns, and the sounds of fiddle music and laughter spilled out into the evening air. Matthew helped Abigail down from the wagon they'd repaired for the occasion, conscious of the eyes turning toward them as they approached the entrance. A middle-aged woman Matthew recognized as the minister's wife greeted them at the door. "Miss O'Connor, how wonderful to see you joining us at last. And Mr. Jameson, welcome back to Coloma. Please come in and enjoy yourselves." The warm welcome set the tone for much of the evening. While there were certainly curious glances and whispered conversations, most of the townspeople were cordial, even friendly. The women of the community seemed particularly pleased to finally meet Abigail properly, and several offered advice about gardening or preserving that she accepted graciously. Matthew found himself drawn into conversations with men he had known before the war, catching up on 8 years of changes in Coloma. Some faces were missing casualties of war, disease, or the natural progression of frontier life, but enough familiar ones remained to give him a sense of connection to the community he had once been part of. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Matthew turned to find Abigail watching him from across the room. Their eyes met, and a wordless understanding passed between them. He crossed to her side and extended his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss O'Connor?" Abigail placed her hand in his. "I would be delighted, Mr. Jameson." As Matthew led her onto the dance floor, he was acutely aware of the eyes following them. But as they began to move together to the music, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. Abigail fit perfectly in his arms, following his lead with a natural grace that made his self-consciousness about rusty dancing skills evaporate. "People are watching us," Abigail murmured, though she didn't seem particularly concerned. "Let them watch," Matthew replied, his hand firm at the small of her back. "We have nothing to hide." The dance ended too soon for Matthew's liking, but propriety dictated that they separate for the next one. Before he could escort Abigail back to the side of the room, however, Edward Wilson approached them. "Matthew, Miss O'Connor, good evening to you both." Matthew nodded stiffly. "Edward." "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," Edward said to Abigail, extending his hand. "Edward Wilson. My family runs the bank in Coloma." "A pleasure, Mr. Wilson," Abigail replied politely. "I believe it was your father I dealt with when purchasing the farm. Indeed, he handled most sales until recently." Edward glanced between them. "I must say it's unexpected to see you both here together. The arrangement you've struck has been the subject of some discussion in town." Before Matthew could respond, Abigail spoke, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. "Mr. Jameson has been invaluable in helping restore the farm. His knowledge of the land has saved me months of trial and error. As for any arrangement, we are business partners working toward mutual prosperity, nothing more or less." Edward seemed taken aback by her directness. "Of course, Miss O'Connor, I meant no offense." "None taken, I'm sure," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe the refreshment table is calling." As they moved away, Matthew couldn't help but admire how effectively Abigail had handled the situation. "You put him in his place rather neatly," he observed quietly. "Men like Edward Wilson believe they can dictate the terms of everyone else's existence because they control the money," Abigail replied. "I've encountered his type before in Denver. They understand only direct communication." The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly, with more dancing and conversation. By the time they departed, Matthew felt that they had successfully established themselves as respectable members of the community, despite their unconventional living arrangement. The night was clear and star-filled as they rode back to the farm. Abigail sat close beside Matthew on the wagon seat, a blanket wrapped around both of them against the evening chill. The proximity was both comforting and exhilarating. "That went better than I expected," Abigail said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Yes," Matthew agreed, "though I suspect will remain a topic of speculation for some time." Abigail leaned slightly against his shoulder. "Let them speculate, we know the truth of our situation." But what was that truth exactly? Matthew wondered. Were they truly just business partners, or was there something more developing between them? The weight of her body against his, the scent of her hair in the night air, suggested possibilities he had not allowed himself to consider fully until now. As they approached the darkened farmhouse, a sense of homecoming washed over Matthew stronger than any he had felt since his return. This place was becoming home again, not just because it was the land of his childhood, but because of the woman beside him who was breathing new life into it. They had been back at the farm for nearly 2 months when the letter arrived. Matthew returned from checking fence lines to find Abigail on the porch, her face pale as she read the single sheet of paper in her trembling hands. "What is it?" he asked, immediately concerned by her expression. Abigail looked up, seeming almost surprised to see him. "It's from the bank. Mr. Wilson, the elder Mr. Wilson, has died." "I'm sorry to hear that," Matthew said, though he had no particular affection for the man who had foreclosed on his family's farm. "But why would that affect you so strongly?" Abigail handed him the letter. "Read it." Matthew scanned the formal text, his concern growing as he understood the implications. The elder Wilson had apparently been the only one at the bank who believed in extending credit to a single woman. With his death, the new management led by Edward Wilson was reviewing all outstanding arrangements. They were calling in a note Abigail had secured to purchase seeds and equipment, demanding payment in full within 30 days. "This is outrageous," Matthew said, anger rising within him. The terms were for repayment after harvest. That was the agreement. "Agreements can be changed when one party holds all the power," Abigail replied, her voice flat. "There's a clause in the contract allowing for early collection in the event of significant changes in bank management." "I read it, but Mr. Wilson assured me it was merely a formality never to be invoked." Matthew crushed the letter in his fist. "This is Edward's doing. He's trying to force you off the land." "But why? What purpose would it serve?" Matthew paced the porch, his mind racing. "I don't know. Perhaps he still bears a grudge against me and sees hurting you as a way to exact revenge. Or maybe someone else wants this land, someone with influence at the bank." Abigail sat heavily on the porch step. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is that I don't have the money to pay the note. Everything I had went into purchasing the farm and the initial supplies. Any profit from this year's harvest was meant to cover the loan." Matthew knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "We'll find a way, Abigail. I have some savings left, not enough to cover everything, but it's a start." She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "I can't ask you to do that, Matthew. This is my problem." "No," he said firmly. "It's our problem. We're partners, remember." The word partners hung between them, carrying more weight than when they had first agreed to work together. In the weeks since the social, their relationship had evolved, though neither had put a name to the changing feelings between them. They still maintained separate sleeping quarters, but their days were spent in close companionship. Their evenings often extended with conversation, and laughter long after work was done. Abigail's eyes searched his face, perhaps seeking reassurance that his offer came from more than mere obligation. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she squeezed his hands and nodded. "Partners," she agreed softly. The next day, Matthew rode into town alone, determined to speak with Edward Wilson directly. The bank was housed in a solid brick building on Coloma's Main Street, its imposing facade designed to inspire confidence and respect. Matthew tied his horse at the hitching post and entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Edward was in his office, visible through an open door. He looked up as Matthew approached, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Matthew, what brings you to the bank today?" "I think you know," Matthew replied, closing the office door behind him for privacy. "I'm here about Miss O'Connor's loan." Edward leaned back in his chair, affecting a posture of casual authority. "Bank business is confidential, Matthew. I can't discuss another client's affairs with you." "Cut the act, Edward. I know you're calling in her note early. I want to know why." Edward's facade of professionalism slipped slightly. "The bank has every right to protect its investments. Miss O'Connor is a risk, a single woman trying to run a farm that defeated even your father, an experienced farmer. It's simple business sense." "It's harassment," Matthew countered. "And I suspect it has more to do with me than with her." A thin smile crossed Edward's face. "You always did think everything revolved around you, Matthew, even Mary Beth." The mention of his former sweetheart was clearly intended to provoke, but Matthew refused to be baited. "This isn't about the past, Edward. It's about the present, about a woman who purchased that land in good faith and is working harder than anyone I've ever known to make it prosper." "Touching," Edward said dryly. "Your concern for Miss O'Connor seems to go beyond business partnership." "The town gossips will be delighted to hear it confirmed." Matthew leaned forward, placing his hands on Edward's desk. "Name your price." "Excuse me," to extend the loan terms back to the original agreement. "Name your price." Edward studied him with new interest. "You're willing to pay personally?" "For her?" The implication was clear, and Matthew had to restrain himself from reaching across the desk and grabbing Edward by his expensive collar. "For the farm, for what's right." After a moment's consideration, Edward named a sum, not the full amount of the loan, but a substantial fee that would strain Matthew's remaining savings to the breaking point. It was extortion, plain and simple, but Matthew saw no alternative. Without those funds, Abigail would lose the farm and he would lose his last connection to his family heritage. "I'll have the money for you tomorrow," Matthew said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Edward's smile was triumphant. "Excellent, I'll have the paperwork ready." As Matthew turned to leave, Edward called after him. "She must be quite special for you to invest so much in her property." Matthew paused at the door. "She is, more than you could possibly understand." The ride back to the farm was a blur of conflicting emotions. Anger at Edward's manipulation ward with concern about how to explain the arrangement to Abigail. She was fiercely independent and proud she wouldn't readily accept what amounted to financial rescue, especially if she understood the personal nature of Edward's vendetta. When he arrived, he found Abigail in the fields, checking the progress of the corn. The young plants were thriving, reaching toward the sun with vibrant green leaves. Seeing her there, surrounded by the fruits of their shared labor, Matthew knew with sudden clarity that his feelings for her had grown far beyond partnership or friendship. He loved her. The realization struck him with the force of physical impact. Somewhere between repairing fences and planting seeds, between dances at the social and quiet conversations by lamplight, he had fallen completely in love with Abigail O'Connor. The knowledge complicated an already complex situation. If he told her about the deal he'd struck with Edward, she might see it as an attempt to create obligation, to bind her to him through financial dependence, precisely the situation she had fled from in Denver. Yet dishonesty between them seemed equally unthinkable. They had built their partnership on mutual respect and transparency. To undermine that now would be to sabotage the very foundation of their relationship. Abigail spotted him and waved, her smile brightening her face as she made her way toward him. Matthew's heart beat faster at the sight, and he knew that whatever came next, he had to be honest with her about the bank, about his feelings, about everything. "You're back earlier than I expected," she said as she reached him. "Did you speak with Edward Wilson?" Matthew nodded, dismounting to stand beside her. "I did. We need to talk, Abigail." The seriousness of his tone wiped the smile from her face. "What happened? Is it worse than we thought?" "No, it's—" Matthew ran a hand through his hair, searching for the right words. "Let's go sit on the porch." This might take a while. Once they were seated side by side on the steps, Matthew explained his conversation with Edward and the deal he had struck to save the farm. He watched Abigail's expression shift from concern to anger to something more complex as she absorbed his words. "So he's doing this because of some old grudge against you?" she asked finally. "Because of this Mary Beth woman? Partly, I think. Edward has always resented me, even before Mary Beth chose him over me. Our fathers were rivals in many ways, his with money, mine with hard work and integrity. I think he sees an opportunity to finally best me completely by taking the farm." Abigail was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant fields. "And you agreed to pay him this extortion without consulting me?" It wasn't a question, but Matthew answered anyway. "Yes." "I'm sorry for that. I should have discussed it with you first, but I was afraid he'd change his mind or raise the price if I hesitated. It's your money, Matthew. Your savings that you worked 8 years to accumulate. I can't let you spend it all on my behalf." Matthew took a deep breath. It was time for complete honesty. "It's not just for you, Abigail, it's for me too, for us." She turned to look at him, confusion in her eyes. "What do you mean, us?" "I mean that somewhere along the way this partnership became something more to me." He reached for her hand, half expecting her to pull away, but she allowed the contact. "I care for you, Abigail, more than I thought possible after so many years of keeping everyone at a distance." Abigail's eyes widened and a flush spread across her cheeks. "Matthew, You don't need to say anything now," he assured her quickly. "I understand this complicates things. I just wanted you to know that my offer to help with the bank isn't about creating obligation or trying to stake a claim on the farm. It's because I can't bear the thought of seeing you hurt or losing what we've built together here." Abigail's free hand came up to touch his face, the gesture so unexpected that Matthew felt his breath catch. "You impossible man," she said softly. "Did it never occur to you that I might feel the same way?" Hope surged through Matthew like a flash flood. "Do you?" Instead of answering with words, Abigail leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, then increasingly confident as Matthew responded. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, expressing months of unspoken feelings. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Abigail rested her forehead against his. "We still have a problem with the bank," she murmured. "We'll face it together," Matthew replied. "Whatever comes next." The solution, when it presented itself, came from an unexpected quarter. 2 days after Matthew's confrontation with Edward, they received a visitor at the farm sheriff Daniel Carter, riding up to the house in the late afternoon as they were finishing the day's work. "Miss O'Connor, Mr. Jameson," he greeted them, dismounting and removing his hat. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Sheriff," Abigail replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you out this way?" Carter seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "It's a somewhat delicate matter. Perhaps we could sit." They settled on the porch, with Matthew bringing a cup of water for their visitor. The sheriff took a long drink before speaking. "It's come to my attention that the bank may be treating you unfairly, Miss O'Connor. Calling in loans early, charging excessive fees, that sort of thing." Matthew and Abigail exchanged surprised glances. "How did you hear about that?" Matthew asked. "Let's just say I have friends at the bank who don't approve of Edward Wilson's methods." The sheriff set his cup down. "But more importantly, I've received complaints from other customers, all women, all facing similar pressure since the elder Wilson's passing." "So we're not being specifically targeted?" Abigail asked. "Oh, I think you are," Carter replied, giving Matthew a significant look. "But you're not alone. And that's important, legally speaking." "What do you mean?" Matthew leaned forward, hope beginning to stir. "There are laws against certain kinds of discrimination in lending. Not many, and they're not always enforced, but they exist. The territorial governor has taken a particular interest in such matters recently, especially after his own sister was denied a business loan under questionable circumstances." Abigail's expression brightened. "Are you suggesting we could challenge the bank legally?" "I'm suggesting that a letter from the governor's office might encourage Edward Wilson to reconsider his current policies." The sheriff smiled slightly. "Such a letter might already be on its way to Coloma, in fact." Matthew felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Sheriff Carter, I don't know how to thank you." The sheriff waved away his gratitude. "No need for thanks. I'm just doing my job, making sure everyone in Coloma gets fair treatment under the law." He rose to his feet. "I'd expect things to sort themselves out within the week. In the meantime, don't worry about making any payments to the bank." After the sheriff departed, Matthew and Abigail sat in stunned silence for a moment before breaking into relieved laughter. Matthew pulled Abigail into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "I can hardly believe it," she said when he set her down. "After everything, to have help come from such an unexpected direction." "It seems we've made more friends in Coloma than we realized," Matthew replied. That evening they sat together on a blanket near the creek, watching fireflies begin to emerge in the gathering dusk. The air was warm, scented with summer blossoms and the rich earth of the fields. With the threat from the bank apparently neutralized, they could finally look forward to the harvest and beyond. "What happens next?" Abigail asked, her head resting on Matthew's shoulder. "For us, I mean." Matthew took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "What would you like to happen?" Abigail was quiet for a moment, considering. "When I bought this farm, I thought I was choosing independence over companionship. I never imagined I might find both in the same place. And now," she turned to face him, her expression serious but tender. "Now I'm thinking that partnerships come in many forms, business, friendship." She paused, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Marriage." Matthew's heart seemed to stop, then resume at double speed. Abigail O'Connor, are you proposing to me? Her laugh was soft in the gathering darkness. Perhaps I am. Would that be so terrible? Instead of answering immediately, Matthew reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. I've been carrying this for a week, waiting for the right moment. He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band. It was my mother's. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. Tears glistened in Abigail's eyes as she looked from the ring to Matthew's face. And is that what you want, to spend your life with me? More than anything, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Abigail, will you marry me, make this farm our home together? Yes, she whispered, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. Yes, I will. Their kiss sealed the promise, tender and passionate beneath the first stars of evening. When they finally broke apart, Matthew kept her close in his arms, unwilling to let go of this newfound happiness. The deed to the farm, Abigail said suddenly. We should have it changed to include both our names. Matthew pulled back slightly to look at her. Are you sure? You don't have to do that. I want to, she replied firmly. This land is part of you, Matthew. It should belong to both of us, legally and in every other way. Her generosity humbled him. This woman who had fought so hard for independence was willing to share everything with him, trusting him in a way he knew came at no small cost to her. I love you, he said simply, the words feeling inadequate to express the depth of his feelings. And I love you, she replied. Now let's go home, we have a harvest to prepare for. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and joy in equal measure. As Sheriff Carter had predicted, a formal letter arrived from the territorial governor's office, and shortly thereafter, Edward Wilson sent notification that all loans would continue under their original terms. The threat to their farm was removed, allowing Matthew and Abigail to focus on their future together. They were married in late August, just before harvest time, in a simple ceremony at the Coloma church. The townspeople turned out in force, any lingering gossip about their living arrangements silenced by the obvious devotion between them. Even Edward Wilson attended, though he left immediately after the ceremony, his congratulations noticeably absent. Mary Beth Wilson approached them at the reception, her 3 children in tow. She was still beautiful, though in a more matronly way than Matthew remembered, and her smile seemed genuine as she offered her best wishes. I'm glad you found happiness, Matthew, she said quietly while Abigail was distracted by well-wishers. We were too young when you left, too different in what we wanted from life, but she suits you perfectly. Matthew nodded, surprised to find no lingering pain in seeing his former sweetheart. Thank you, Mary Beth. I hope you have found happiness as well. A shadow crossed her face briefly. Edward provides well for us, she said, which wasn't quite an answer. Before Matthew could respond, she moved away, gathering her children to leave. The first harvest exceeded their expectations, the corn standing tall and plentiful by early October. They worked side by side bringing it in, Matthew teaching Abigail the traditional harvest songs his father had sung, their voices blending with the rustle of dry stalks and the calls of migrating geese overhead. By the time winter arrived, they had repaired the farmhouse completely, adding a new room for the future they both hoped would include children. The restored barn housed 2 milk cows and 4 horses, with space prepared for more livestock in the spring. The root cellar was stocked with preserved vegetables and fruits. The corn crib full to bursting on Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire in the main room, a small pine tree decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries standing in the corner. Outside, snow fell gently, blanketing the farm in pristine white. I have something for you, Abigail said, rising to retrieve a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Matthew unwrapped it carefully to reveal a beautifully bound ledger. Opening it, he found page after page of careful drawings of the farmhouse as it had been when he first returned, then progressively restored. The fields at different stages of planting and growth. The apple trees in blossom. And finally, a a detailed sketch of Matthew himself, standing on the porch looking out over the land. "Abigail, this is extraordinary," he said, touched beyond words. "I had no idea you could draw like this." She smiled, pleased by his reaction. "I've been working on it since summer. I wanted to document our first year here together, how we transformed the farm from what it was to what it's becoming." Matthew set the book aside carefully and reached beneath the tree for his gift to her. The package was small but heavy. Abigail unwrapped it to find a wooden box with her initials, now AJ rather than a O, carved into the lid. Inside were dozens of seed packets, each labeled in Matthew's neat handwriting, varieties of vegetables, flowers, and grains, many heirloom types that had become rare in recent years. "I wrote to farmers all over the territory," Matthew explained. "Asked for their best and most unusual seeds. Some of these varieties aren't available commercially anymore, they're passed down through families." Abigail ran her fingers over the packets reverently. "Our own seed bank. For future generations. For our children and their children after them," Matthew agreed, pulling her into his arms. Abigail settled against his chest, her expression thoughtful. "Speaking of children," she said after a moment, "I have one more Christmas gift for you, though it won't arrive until summer." Matthew looked at her questioningly, then understanding dawned. "Abigail, are you?" She nodded, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "Dr. Reynolds confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have a baby, Matthew." Joy unlike anything he had ever known flooded through him. Matthew gathered Abigail even closer, burying his face in her hair as tears pricked his eyes. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the Jameson farm in a pristine blanket that would nourish the soil come spring. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Matthew and Abigail held each other, dreaming of the future they would build together on this land that had called them both home. The following summer brought not only their first child, a son they named Timothy after Matthew's father, but also their most abundant harvest yet. The farm that had once been neglected and nearly lost forever now thrived under their joint care, a testament to what could be accomplished through persistence, hard work, and love. As Matthew stood on the porch one evening in early autumn, his son sleeping peacefully in his arms while Abigail tended to the garden nearby, he reflected on the journey that had brought him back to this place. 8 years of wandering, of emptiness, had been the price he paid to find his way home, not just to the land, but to the woman who had made it a home again. Abigail looked up from her work, catching his gaze, and smiled that same smile that had first captured his heart when she stood amid the ruins of his family farm with seeds in her basket and hope in her eyes. She set aside her tools and came to join him on the porch, wrapping an arm around his waist as they looked out over their land together. "Happy?" she asked softly. Matthew looked down at their sleeping son, then at the fields stretching golden toward the horizon, and finally at the woman beside him, his partner, his wife, his heart. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, and bent to kiss her as the sun set on the Jameson farm, casting long shadows across the land that would sustain their family for generations to come.